Moving on from our sensory pathways, and our second learning objective focuses on the motor pathways, or the pathways that nerve impulses take from our brain out to our effectors. So our motor pathways, which are also called descending pathways, because they transmit motor information down from the central nervous system to the effectors in the peripheral nervous system. Once that information reaches the effector, an output occurs, which may be the contraction of a muscle or the secretion of a substance from a particular gland. So here we have a motor nerve impulse originating from the motor cortex. It travels down or descends through the brainstem. It decussates or crosses over to the other side. It runs down the spinal cord to where it exits via a spinal nerve and innervates a skeletal muscle. So where our sensory neural pathways are typically broken up into first, second, and third order neurons, our motor pathways are organised into upper and lower motor neurons. So an upper motor neuron is the motor neuron that originates from the cerebral cortex or the brainstem. Upper motor neurons from the cerebral cortex allow for the execution of voluntary movements of the body. Upper motor neurons originating from the brainstem regulate things like muscle tone and the muscles that control posture, balance, and the orientation of the head and the body. Upper motor neurons then synapse with lower motor neurons, which have their cell bodies in the brainstem or the spinal cord. From the cell bodies in the brainstem, these lower motor neurons extend through cranial nerves to innervate skeletal muscles of the face and the head. And from the cell bodies in the spinal cord, they exit through our spinal nerves to innervate skeletal muscles of the limbs and the trunk. Now, next week, we begin to look at muscles in the lectures and the labs. However, very briefly, skeletal muscle is that muscle that's connected to bone and produces movement. These are also the muscles that we can voluntarily control. Now, the axons of the upper motor neurons extend down from the brain and the brainstem via two types of pathways, either direct or indirect. A direct motor pathway provides input to lower motor neurons via axons that extend directly from the primary motor cortex. Indirect motor pathways provide input to lower motor neurons from other regions of the brain, so motor sensors in the basal nuclei or ganglia, the cerebellum, and other areas of the cerebral cortex. Once this input reaches the lower motor neurons, however, the output generated or the nerve impulses received by those lower motor neurons, which go on to innervate skeletal muscles, is still exactly the same. So nerve impulses for voluntary movements propagate from the primary motor cortex to lower motor neurons via direct motor pathways. The direct motor pathways are also known as the pyramidal pathways due to the shape of the cell bodies of these neurons, which look like a pyramid. Now we have two direct motor pathways or pyramidal pathways. These are known as the corticospinal pathways and the corticobulbar pathway. Our indirect pathways, which are also called the extrapyramidal pathways because they are outside those pyramidal cells, include all of the other somatic motor tracts outside of the corticospinal and the corticobulbar tracts. So these descend from various nuclei in the brainstem, and they influence activities such as the voluntary movement of our distal limbs, reflexive movements of the head and the eyes, and posture and balance. So our indirect pathways include the rubrospinal, the tectospinal, the vestibulospinal, and the reticulospinal pathways. So the first of our direct motor pathways, so coming directly from that motor cortex, are the corticospinal pathways. And these pathways conduct impulses for the control of skeletal muscle of the limbs and the trunk. Axons of upper motor neurons form the corticospinal tracts, which we can see here are our lateral corticospinal tract and our anterior corticospinal tract, which descend through the cerebral cortex and the midbrain to the medulla, where those bundles of axons form the bulges on the front side of the medulla that we know as the medullary pyramids. About 90% of the axons in the corticospinal tract will decussate, or they'll cross over in the medulla, and then descend into the spinal cord, where they then synapse with the lower motor neuron. The 10% that don't decussate in the medulla will descend through the medulla and then cross over lower down in the spinal cord. Now, as we pointed out in this image, within the corticospinal pathway, there are two corticospinal tracts, the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. The corticospinal axons that decussate or cross over in the medulla form our lateral corticospinal tract. So they run down the lateral column of the spinal cord, which remember is these parts here and here. These axons synapse with lower motor neurons in the spinal cord and then exit the spinal cord via a spinal nerve, where it innervates the skeletal muscle that controls movements of the distal parts of the limbs. So the distal parts of the limbs, like our hands and our feet, are responsible for quite precise, agile and highly skilled movements. So think about things like playing the piano or even buttoning up your shirt. It's quite a skilled, precise movement. The corticospinal axons, so about the 10% of those corticospinal axons that do not cross over in the medulla, form our anterior corticospinal tract. It runs down the anterior white column of the spinal cord. And at each spinal cord level, these axons will decussate or cross over, and that's where they will then synapse with the lower motor neurons and exit via spinal nerves to innervate skeletal muscle that controls movements of the trunk and the proximal parts of limbs. So our trunk or our midsection, kind of our shoulders and our hip regions. Now these movements will be larger and stronger, but less precise than those achieved by the hands and the feet. So this image is just for showing that full neural pathway. So we have the lateral corticospinal pathway on this side here, where this pathway forms the axons that cross over or decussate in the medulla and then run down and exit the spinal nerve. Our anterior corticospinal tract is the tract that runs down. It doesn't cross over in the medulla. It crosses over at the region or the level of the spinal cord where that lower motor neuron will actually exit. The corticobulbar pathway is our other type of direct pathway that conducts nerve impulses for the control of skeletal muscles in the head. Axons of upper motor neurons from the motor cortex form the corticobulbar tract, which descend through the cortex and the midbrain, kind of alongside those corticospinal tracts. Now, some of the axons of the corticobulbar tract decussate and others do not. So not even lower down, they just don't cross over at all. The axons of the upper motor neurons of this pathway will terminate in the motor nuclei of 9 pairs of our cranial nerves in the brainstem. The lower motor neurons of these cranial nerves will then carry these nerve impulses that control precise voluntary movements of the eyes, the tongue, and the neck to allow things like chewing, facial expression, speech, and swallowing. So the corticospinal tracts control the movement of our trunk and our limbs. The corticobulbar tract or pathway controls movement of our head and our neck. So once more, just giving you that visual here. So we've got these neurons extending from the primary motor cortex. Some will decussate and exit via a cranial nerve. Some will stay on that same side of the body and exit on a cranial nerve on that same side. Now lastly, the indirect motor pathways are those outside of the corticospinal and the corticobulbar tracts. And these ones have upper motor neurons which descend from areas of the cortex that sit outside of the primary motor cortex. So similar to the sensory spinocerebellar tracts, I don't need you to know about these pathways in detail, but you do need to be aware that they exist and I guess have some idea of their presence and their general function. So within the indirect pathways, we have the rubrospinal pathway. So this innervates contralateral muscles, so muscles on the opposite side of the body, which govern precise movements of the distal parts of the upper limbs, so essentially your hands. The tectospinal pathway also innervates contralateral muscles, so muscles on the opposite side of the body. But in this pathway, they innervate muscles which are reflexively moved in the head, the eyes, and the trunk in response to visual or auditory stimuli. So, for example, when you hear a really loud bang or something makes a really loud noise and you kind of pull your head away reflexively, the tectospinal pathway will be involved with that movement. We then have the vestibulocochlear pathway. So this innervates ipsilateral movement. So these are muscles on the same side. It's in the trunk and the proximal part of the limbs. These muscles help maintain posture and balance in response to head movements. And then lastly, we have the medial and the lateral reticulospinal pathway, which also innervates ipsilateral muscles of the trunk and the proximal limbs. And this helps maintain posture and muscle tone in response to body movements. So vestibulocochlear pathway is maintaining posture in response to head movements. Our medial and lateral reticulospinal pathway maintains posture and muscle tone in response to body movements.